Bows have always been given the short end of the stick in Elden Ring. From Software for some reason just seemed too scared to buff them, as I guess they feared that they would be too broken and ruin the game. Well, that resulted in a super mediocre weapon class and made bow-only runs a disaster to play for most. It would involve running away from enemies, using summons, and farming for arrows every other fight. Not to mention that there was only really one competent bow, and that was Radahn's Great Bow, and all that weapon did was act as a casting stick for rain of arrows. To sum all that up, bows used to be a boring, terrible mess that people would almost always only use for challenge runs, and not ever willingly. That brings us to the video today. The DLC brought some new weapons to the bow roster, and it actually made me and many others want to use these weapons, and not just go use it because we ran out of ideas. Along with going over these new weapons, I will be briefly going over the rest of my build and telling you guys what went well, what sucked, and just comment on my experience as an archer going through the DLC. Okay, time to get into the details. The first new weapon and the primary option in this build is Ansbach's longbow. It does decent damage and acts like a short bow, so its moveset allows it to shoot an arrow quickly after rolling, sprinting, or jumping. This makes the bow not only fire faster, but also makes the fights much more enjoyable, as you won't just stop moving for a couple seconds begging for the enemy to smack you, but rather you're running and dodging while getting chip damage in. Though that is not all when it comes to this new bow. What makes it truly great is its skill, Fanshot. This skill fires 8 arrows at once, and for some reason as long as you hit at least one, the enemy will take the damage of all 8. This means you can use the skill at a much farther distance, and the area coverage is also amazing. Depending on the arrows you use, you can get anywhere between great and insane damage. This skill does come with one downside though, and that is it requires 8 arrows every time you use the skill. This means you will eat through your arrow supply fast, and often you can struggle to get through even one boss fight. To counteract this, I usually found myself equipping different arrow types, and one slot always being regular arrows. As I hate farming, and if I'm using that many arrows per shot, I found that regular arrows work best as they provide respectable damage and don't make me go farm so often. The other arrow slot I usually fill with the lightning bone arrow, as it does good damage and it's easy to farm if you have the bell bearing from the War Master's shack that allows you to buy thin beast bones from the Twin Maidens. The other material, Fulgur Blooms, can be picked up in loads outside Castle Sol, and I found myself only needing to restock very rarely. I chose lightning as my damage type for this arrow because not many enemies in this game resist lightning, and so it is generally a safe bet to go with. Quick disclaimer, these arrows are certainly not the best choices to make for damage or proccing status effects. It is just what I chose as I really dislike all the farming that typically comes with the other options. The next weapon I used was one I was really excited for ever since the trailer for the DLC, that being the repeating crossbow. Sadly, I will say that it is not too great, as it really lacks damage and also drains so much stamina with the skill, but I chose to equip it just because it is fun sometimes to whip out a machine gun to mow down some trash mobs. I never really found myself using it in boss fights, however. As you can see in the footage, it really is not that effective, and compared to Ansbach's longbow, it is completely outclassed. Not great, but still a fun gimmick, and I like to play with it throughout the run. The last weapon I found myself using is the Albinauric bow. This is the only weapon we are using that is not from the DLC. I use this for single-shot sniping as I work my way through areas. I found myself usually using the Albinauric bow to clear out the smaller enemies in an area, before switching to the Ansbach longbow for the bigger enemies and bosses, as it is much better for long-lasting fights, as its fast fire rate and very potent skill allow you to dodge and put up good damage. The Albinauric bow is good for its niche use and also great at conserving arrows, as with the Mighty Shot Ash of War, it can get a lot of damage out of just one shot. Stats are simple for this build, focusing mostly on dexterity, as the Ansbach bow has a very high dex requirement and also scales slightly better with dexterity than strength. The other reason for high dexterity is that the Albinauric bow scales solely on this stat, and the repeating crossbow does not scale with anything, so it does not matter. As far as the rest of the stats, I go with the typical vigor, endurance in mind for the DLC, and I would definitely not go less than what I have for endurance, as the skill and constant shots between rolls really do eat through your stamina bar quickly. Talismans are pretty self-explanatory, but I go with the obvious choices of the Arrow Sting and Arrow Soaring Sting talismans for an increase in damage as well as range for your arrows and bolts. These talismans also stack, so I would definitely recommend using both of them. Another given is the Shard of Alexander to boost the Fanshot, Mighty Shot, and repeating fire skills, and trust me, this makes a huge difference. Then, for the last slot, I used the Crimson Seed Talisman just because I personally like the increased healing it provides. You could also benefit from the Blue Dancer Charm, as it will definitely help with your overall DPS, but you would have to sacrifice using anything but super light armor. Another option to consider would be the Sharp Shot Talisman, as it will boost the attack power of scoped in shots, but that only affects the Albinauric bow, as that is the only weapon where we would utilize this mechanic. Armor is just whatever looks coolest for you, but keep it light if you do go with the Blue Dancer Charm. I'm just using the Ronin armor set because I like the cape, but go with whatever fits your fashion and defensive needs. If you want the best possible armor for this build, it would be the Rakshasa armor, as each piece buffs your overall damage by 2%, adding up to 8% more damage with the full set equipped. My experience with this playstyle in the DLC was overall positive. Bosses like Mesmer and Rolana were so much fun, as they just had the right amount of health and both give you a little time in between attacks to get some nice poke damage. Additionally, they both have some openings after big moves that let you get off a Fanshot for massive damage. The other main bosses were also all good fights, and none of them felt like they overstayed their welcome. The downsides of this build are, like I mentioned, the arrow farming issue, but also fights in confined spaces. Going through caves or catacombs can be rough, as there really is not much room to allow you to pick off targets, and so this often results in you getting assaulted by multiple enemies with very little space to move around. These locations definitely show off the glaring weaknesses of bow builds, but luckily these places are not super common. I found that this DLC still suffers from many enemies not really fitting well into the bow playstyle, but the massive improvement I noticed the most would be having the option for relatively quick burst damage through the usage of the Fanshot skill. Sure, it eats up a lot of arrows, but it fixes the issue of bows lacking any sort of burst damage potential in the base game, and this really discouraged a lot of players from committing to this challenge, as unless you have perfected each boss fight and can dodge every move flawlessly, you will get hit and eventually die as the fights move super slow with the otherwise low DPS of bows. Really liked this addition and definitely made the overall build more fun to play. This run was definitely a challenge compared to the more normal runs I've had through the DLC, but not for a lack of damage. The difficulty came from a huge 180 in terms of how you play. You need to pick off groups one by one, isolate enemies, dodge out rather than into attacks, and keep distance between you and your target. All of these things are not intuitive and are often the opposite of what I used to do. It took some adjusting, but I really did have fun with this run, and I would fully suggest that you guys try this playstyle out for yourself. It is not perfect, but it definitely got improved, and I'm very content with the state that bows are in now. Alright everyone, that is it for the video today. I had a great time making this video, and it was a run I was planning for a while. If you have any questions or have any potential improvement ideas for the build, leave a comment and I'll be sure to look at them all. I wanted to quickly thank you all for the support you have shown me, and I am super grateful for the early growth this channel has had. I promise to continue to make content and will improve more and more with each video. With that, like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and regardless, thank you for watching. Until next time.